This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. More on them later in the video. China wants Russia to win the Ukrainian war. This is far from obvious, since the CCP is trying to sound as neutral as possible. When we read the statements from the Chinese government's website on Ukraine, we see talk about sovereignty, peace talks, and resolving the humanitarian crisis. Not exactly what a bunch of staunch Putin supporters would say. But what if I tell you that this is just a facade to hide China's true intentions? Secretly, the country is giving Russia some of the most important resources for the war. China is Russia's biggest gunpowder supplier, single-handedly keeping Russia's ammunition factories afloat. Meanwhile, it provides no gunpowder to Ukraine or its allies, who are in desperate shortage. But this should come as no surprise. Shortly before the invasion started, Putin visited Xi Jinping and signed a no-limits partnership. In their joint document, the two criticized the US by name 6 times and opposed NATO's expansion. Later, reports from the New York Times suggested that China already knew about the invasion before it signed the document. Understandably, this has led to fears that China would help Putin in the Ukraine war. After all, their joint document said, and I quote, "There are no forbidden areas of cooperation." Although Beijing still refrains from giving direct lethal aid, it's definitely clear on which side it's on. As the biggest competitor of the United States, China kind of likes what Russia is doing. So let's take a deep dive into how China is secretly trying to make Russia win, and why it would want to do this in the first place.
This factory in Pennsylvania is making Ukraine's most important ammunition. 155mm rounds are basically giant bullets used in artillery guns.
Military officials estimate that Ukraine needs 200,000 a month to actually fight this war, to keep on par with Russia, and US capacity at somewhere around 28,000.
Biggest problem is we don't have enough of ammunition for it.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned that China may soon provide lethal assistance in the form of weapons and ammunition to Russia's war in Ukraine.
First off, let's look at the situation in Ukraine. Over the last year or so, the conflict has turned into an artillery war. The front lines entered into a stalemate, and very little territory changed hands. A lot of attention is now going to the artillery campaigns, which are doing heavy damage on both sides. With artillery, you can damage enemy positions, armor, and supply lines at relatively low cost, and eventually just drain them out. Currently, about 70% of the losses in the conflict are because of artillery shelling. Eventually, a breakthrough could be possible if either Russia or Ukraine runs out of resources or soldiers. Putin is betting that Ukraine will lose this war of attrition, and he has some of the numbers on his side. First of all, he has way more people to send to the battlefield because of Russia's larger population. Winning with sheer amount of manpower is a proven tactic in Russia, going back to World War II. But what's really scary is the ammunition advantage that Russia has. Currently, the Russian military is firing 7 times more artillery shells than Ukraine, according to the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister. This is due to an increasing ammunition shortage on the Ukrainian side. It wasn't always like this, though, as it has changed significantly over the last months. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine was using around 7,000 artillery shells a day, much more than Russia's 5,000. But at the beginning of 2024, Ukraine only used 2,000 rounds a day, while Russia doubled its figure to 10,000. There's a little bit of nuance, though, as Ukraine's artillery has proven to be much more effective. Ukraine has been destroying 4 Russian howitzers for every 1 it loses. Because it has a technology edge, it can trace down and destroy enemy firing positions way more effectively. But the scary thing about Russia is that it doesn't care. If Ukraine is 4 times more effective, Russia will just fire 5 times more shells. And there's nothing much Ukraine's allies can do about this. The NATO alliance isn't able to produce enough ammunition, which resulted in dwindling supplies for Ukraine. Russia is producing 3 times more artillery shells than the United States and Europe combined. The nation makes 250,000 shells a month, or about 3 million shells every year. In comparison, the US only has a monthly production of 28,000. The process of upgrading this capacity will take quite a while, because the infrastructure is simply not there yet. To get to Russia's level of production, the West needs billions of dollars and several months, if not years, of construction. The US plans to increase its shell production to 100,000 a month in 2025. But it's not clear whether this will be in time to help Ukraine. NATO could run out of its ammunition supply, with disastrous consequences. The United States has already sent hundreds of thousands of shells from its strategic stockpiles to Ukraine. All over the world, Washington has ammunition reserves to back its military presence abroad. And these reserves formed a big part of Ukraine's supply. In 2023, the US transferred 300,000 shells from South Korea and 300,000 shells from Israel to Ukraine. The problem is that this can't go on forever. The US doesn't want to become too weak in other regions, meaning that this lifeline could be nearing its end. What makes ammunition problems even worse is that the resources for shell production are in short supply. The most concerning shortage has to be with gunpowder. But before we dive into that, I have a gift for you guys. I'm sure you love geopolitics, and that's why you're watching this video. It's the same reason why I think you guys would love today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. It's a military-themed PvP strategy game where you choose a real country to lead in modern global warfare up against 128 other players. You can use many different units to build up your army. Tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, whatever you need to engage in epic battles or build alliances all over the world. When you're watching the videos, you can think about geopolitics. And when you're not watching the videos, you can make sure that your country in Conflict of Nations is a geopolitical leader in your world. My favorite feature is the fact that I can play this on PC and my phone. That means I'm always on it, staying ahead of my competition. Best of all, you can use the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't lose out. I will see you guys in the game. Alright, now back to the video. According to the French President Macron, this is one of the key problems that the NATO alliance has at the moment. He said that, quote, powder is really what's lacking today. The European Union promised to supply 1 million shells to Ukraine, but it could really only deliver about 30% of this number. The lack of gunpowder is one of the main causes for this failure. Without gunpowder, you can't create the propellant charge needed for artillery rounds. NATO's shortage of gunpowder can be traced back to one chemical called nitrocellulose, or gun cotton. This is where China comes in. According to an EU International Market Commissioner, China is a major gun cotton supplier to the West. Well, at least it used to be. Just a few months ago, the country suddenly halted its gun cotton exports to the West. You would almost think that it purposely tried to create an ammunition shortage. Although the West does have its own nitrocellulose facilities in the US, Germany, and France, it's not enough to keep up with demand. And these suspicions of China causing this shortage get even worse. Last year, the New York Times uncovered huge gunpowder exports from a private Chinese company to Russia. The state-owned company, called Poly Technologies, exported gunpowder to Russia ammunition factories. And not just like a little bit. It was enough gunpowder to produce at least 80 million rounds of ammunition. So this proves two things. China has an enormous gunpowder manufacturing capability, and it would rather sell it to Russia than to Ukraine. Poly Technologies claims that the gunpowder wasn't for military purposes. But I mean, you can decide for yourself if you think that's believable. Russia itself produces very little nitrocellulose, so it desperately needs imports to maintain its gunpowder supply. Along with Turkish companies reselling Western-made gun cotton to Russia, China has played a vital role in providing this resource. According to a British-Ukrainian research group, China is now the largest nitrocellulose supplier to Russia. It uncovered 72 deliveries worth of over $10 million. And if you think about it, the true Chinese supply of nitrocellulose might even be bigger. If China supplies Russia with gunpowder, it would want to do this as secretly as possible. The US and the European Union have already sanctioned several Chinese firms because of their role in the Ukraine war. And to prevent this, China might disguise its gun cotton exports as normal civilian products. This aligns with information from the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Several US intelligence briefings were leaked on a Discord server showing some very interesting information. An intercept of Russian intelligence revealed a deal with China to supply lethal military aid. The only provision was that the trade would have to remain secret. If the deal went through, there may be even more gun cotton exports that we don't know about. Understandably, this has raised some alarm bells in Washington. The US has warned China against helping Russia, saying that there would be, quote-unquote, real costs. But these developments don't come as a huge surprise. There are many other ways China is helping its northern neighbor. China exports large amounts of dual-use technology to Russia, things that can have both civilian and military applications. For example, one Russian company bought 100,000 bulletproof vests and 100,000 helmets from a manufacturer in Shanghai. Obviously, these enormous quantities can only have one goal: to equip the Russian soldiers, but it's very hard to prove this, because they get labeled as things like airsoft helmets. Other dual-use products include ceramics, drones, and thermal optics. Ceramics are not only used for mugs and plates and so on, but also for military purposes. Because the material is so strong, you can find it in armored vehicles and body armor. In 2023, China sold $227 million worth of ceramics to Russia, up from the $135 million the year before. And one thing is for sure, this is not because teacups have gotten so popular in Moscow. A noteworthy detail is that China only exported $5 million of ceramics to Ukraine in 2023. This was less than a quarter of the $23 million before the war. Once again, China is favoring Russia. We can also see this in the exports of drones, which are also dual-use products. You can use them just for fun, or to discover enemy positions and drop grenades on them. China has long been a drone supplier to Russia, with $115 million worth of exports in 2023. But for Ukraine, it's a different story. China sold Ukraine $15 million worth of drones in 2021, but that came crashing down to just $3 million in 2023. Ukraine used to get cheap drones from China and then turn them into useful military tools. However, China noticed this and restricted its drone exports to Ukraine. This was to prevent them being used for quote-unquote non-peaceful purposes. Meanwhile, Beijing turns a blind eye to Russian drone purchases, even when they are explicitly labeled for special military operations. Semiconductors are another Chinese dual-use export to Russia, which surged from $200 million to $500 million after the war. Interestingly, Hong Kong is also a part of this technology lifeline to Russia. It supplied $400 million worth of chips in 2022 alone. Not only does this help Russia deal with the economic impact of the sanctions, but it is also vital for many defense systems. In Russian drones and tanks, the Ukrainians are finding increasingly more Chinese-made electronics. China is also providing support on the logistics side of Russia's war effort. In December of 2022, super heavy truck shipments to Russia were up by 1,143%. You need those trucks to move heavy military equipment to the front lines. And if we really dig deep, we can find another way China is secretly supporting Russia. I mean, literally, dig deep. Russian imports of shoveling equipment and excavators from China were up 100% and 200% respectively. Although it doesn't seem obvious, this is also dual-use technology. Russia is using these as trench digging equipment for the more than 600 miles or around 1,000-kilometer front line. Of course, this is something that China gladly helped them with. But the most effective way that China is supporting Russia may be this. With machinery, China is helping Russia to expand its military-industrial base. In 2023, 90% of Russia's $900 million machine tool imports came from China. This bypasses sanctions from other machinery exporters like Germany and the United States. The Chinese products will be used to build Russia's war economy, something that's worrying NATO. Russia is rapidly increasing its production capacity, with 520,000 new people being employed in its defense manufacturing since the start of the war. And through trade in gun cotton and dual-use products, Russia can also rely on China's defense industry. This makes its industrial base for a war of attrition even stronger. Both Xi Jinping and Putin realize that the conflict could be won this way, because it's one of NATO's weak points, NATO has the money, but not the factories and the supply chains, especially in the case of shells and gun cotton. This is very unfortunate. According to European defense officials, the few factories that it has are already running at full capacity. It will take 3 years to increase gunpowder production because the supply lines for all kinds of raw materials are just not there yet. It would be a huge blunder for NATO to lose the war in Ukraine over this. But when we look at what's happened over the past 80 years, this was bound to happen. In terms of quality, the West's military has gotten more advanced than ever. But in quantity, there has been a huge decline. During the World Wars, the US and European countries had huge factories for artillery shells and gunpowder. The US in particular proved itself as an industrial powerhouse. During World War II, it created 41.4 billion rounds of small ammunition, enough to shoot every human alive at the time 10 times. Yes, they went a little bit over the top. In US ammunition production alone, 250,000 people were working in the 25 assembly plants and 23 propellant and explosive plants. In total, ammunition factories were the size of New York City, Philadelphia, and Chicago combined. But after the World Wars ended, the United States, and especially Europe, lost a lot of their military-industrial capabilities. This was driven by a decrease in spending, which made large-scale ammunition production unfeasible. Governments and defense manufacturers didn't want to invest in expensive factories. When we look at these charts of German, French, and British defense spending as a percentage of GDP, it becomes obvious. They went from spending 4 to 7% of GDP on their militaries in 1960 to somewhere between 1 and 2% now. Ultimately, this meant that they didn't place enough orders for ammunition. And after all, why would they? There seemed to be no threat anymore after the Cold War ended. So military expenditures were just a waste of money. And if things go really south, there's always the protection of the United States under the NATO alliance. The US retained some of its military-industrial power, as it still has the strongest military in the world. But for America, the priority anymore wasn't to fight wars with huge front lines and large artillery campaigns. After the World Wars, the US didn't really fight enemies with similar capabilities. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the opposing armies were smaller and less sophisticated. That's how it ended up with a monthly shell production of just 28,000. More wasn't really necessary. As a result, the US and NATO were a little bit surprised with the current war in Ukraine. A war of attrition with just more than a 600-mile, about 1,000-kilometer long front line hasn't been fought in decades. Just for comparison, one day in Ukraine is an entire month in Afghanistan in terms of ammunition consumption. To fight the proxy war with Russia, NATO needs to adapt, something that takes a long time. By providing resources and machinery, China is giving its ally the means to take advantage of this. With a larger military production quantity, Moscow has a bigger chance of achieving a victory. Now that we know how China is involved in the war in Ukraine, we can move on to why it has even chosen to do so. There are a few reasons why China would want Russia to sustain or even win the war in Ukraine. The most obvious reason is perhaps the Taiwan war scenario. Russia's proxy war with the NATO alliance depletes the West's resources, which is exactly what China needs for a possible attack on Taiwan. Most experts agree that China isn't able to invade Taiwan at the moment because of strong US defenses in the area. But now, the West needs to give all of its attention to Ukraine, which has a direct effect on East Asia. There is currently a $19 billion arms sales backlog of Taiwanese orders for US aircraft and tanks. This is partially because America has sent so much equipment to Ukraine. When China sends gunpowder to Russia, it will enable the Russian military to destroy even more American-made equipment. This will worsen the arms sales backlog to Taiwan. Additionally, the Ukraine war can also have a more subtle effect on the Taiwan war scenario. A NATO defeat on a European battlefield would have huge consequences. It could demoralize and weaken the alliance, giving China an advantage in Taiwan. The NATO allies may not want to get into another costly conflict with huge economic consequences. Apart from the Taiwan invasion, there are more geopolitical motives to take in mind. China now has a lot of influence in Russia due to the war, perhaps reaching excessive levels. After the sanctions hit, China has stepped in to become the biggest trade partner of Russia. In 2023, bilateral trade between the two hit a record $240 billion. Half of Russia's oil and petroleum exports now go to China, and Russia has become China's largest crude oil supplier. Liquefied natural gas exports to China have jumped 47% in 2023, and Russia is selling record amounts at the moment. Even though energy revenues are down, China, together with India, is providing a lifeline for this crucial Russian industry. And for the import market, China is just as important. As you can see on this chart, Russia's imports nearly halved following the invasion. This was mainly because of sanctions from the European Union, which was Russia's biggest import partner at the time. But now, imports are back to their usual levels. China is the sole reason for this increase, with about 70% of Russia's imports coming from the country. Right now, Russia is buying so much from Chinese companies that shipping containers are piling up. The imports include large amounts of raw materials, chemicals, and industrial goods like machinery, things that Russia needs after the sanctions. Basically, China has been a lifesaver for Russian industries. On top of that, half of the Chinese goods are consumer-oriented, including fashion brands or cars. Since 2019, Chinese car sales in Russia have increased by 900%. But with these growing economic ties, there is one thing that stands out. For Russia, China is an economic lifeline, being both the biggest import and export partner. But for China, the story's a little bit different. In 2023, Russia made up only 3.4% of China's exports and 5.5% of imports. The economic relations are so unbalanced that some argue that Russia has become a Chinese vassal state. But there's one catch. If China wants to retain its influence in Russia, the current regime must stay in power. Putin needs to win the war by getting at least some territory, or otherwise he will lose his support. Starting a war and then losing it is never received well by the populace. So, to wrap it all up, China is far from neutral in the Ukraine war. Although the country likes to say it only wants peace, it has way too many reasons to be on Putin's side. As we've uncovered, China is already helping its neighbor through massive gunpowder exports, dual-use products, and machinery. The gunpowder trade in particular is fueling Russia's war effort. This cooperation could turn out to be very successful, because the two strategic partners have found a weakness in NATO's industrial capacity. Lastly, remember you can use the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free for Conflict of Nations. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't lose out. I'll see you guys in the game.